Professor Van Dyke specializes in a number of interesting areas: constitutional law, international law, the law of the sea, and native rights as well as other human rights issues. Professor Van Dyke has consulted with a number of Pacific Island nations as well as teaching in Japan, so his knowledge area and work really expands into the entire Pacific Basin area. And what I've been really lucky to work with him on is Native Hawaiian land issues. And he wrote a book that was published in 2008. It's called Who Owns the Crown Land in Hawaii? And it kind of goes through the long history of Hawaii's public land trust and the rights that has created for Native Hawaiians, and has generated a lot of really good conversation in Hawaii about political recognition for Native Hawaiians, which is something that has been on the table nationally since 2000 and will hopefully be resolved sometime in the near future. So you'll learn more about that today. So thank you very much for being here, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lena, for that very gracious introduction. One of the important things about Sherry is that she is a graduate of this law school. There's never made claims to fame. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for the first half, and then she's going to talk for the second half. And the focus of the talk is going to be on a case that Sherry was the lead attorney on for 14 years, trying to get a moratorium on the public lands in Hawaii. So she'll be talking about that case, which went to the U.S. Supreme Court in more detail during her part of the talk. And I'm going to try to provide some historical background. I know some of you are very familiar with Hawaii, and perhaps others are not. I didn't know anything about Native Hawaiians when I first went out to Hawaii 35 years ago, and so I wanted to sort of set the stage, and then we'll talk more about the legal issues. So Hawaii, of course, is a beautiful archipelago of islands. It's located about 3,000 miles southwest of us here, and it's part of what people call the Polynesian Triangle. The Polynesian people extended up to Hawaii, over here to Easter Island, and down to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then lived in the area within that. And the Native Hawaiians lived a self-sustaining existence, isolated existence, until 1778, when Captain James Cook came to Hawaii, and Westerners started coming. But the Native Hawaiian culture has survived and is still strong in many ways. And they're one of the largest groups of indigenous people in the United States, but they're the only large group of indigenous people that have never had either some kind of settlement with the federal government or a claims commission established within which they can pursue their claims. So they've been left out of the progress that many Native people have made in our country. Before Western contact, they were skilled in many ways, great navigators, traveling these vast distances in the Pacific. Hawaii has a perfect climate, so they didn't, build elaborate houses, but they did have these huge temples that they constructed for religious purposes, and of course they were skilled at hula and chanting, and made beautiful feather capes, and were very skilled at fishing. They developed surfing and introduced that to the world. They had elaborate ceremonies and dances. And one of the things that I personally find particularly amazing is their aquaculture. They were able to develop fish farming in a way that is very complex, and we still don't even understand exactly how they did everything that they did, but many of the fish ponds are still around, and we're trying to restore them and reuse them. Before Westerners came, the Hawaiians had a sense of connectedness with their environment. They didn't make a distinction between living and non-living things. They had their creation stories link themselves to the plants and to the environment. And they felt this connectedness that the environment they were in were part of their ohana and part of their community. And the land, which they called the aina, was not something to be bought and sold. It was something to be nurtured, to be protected, to be developed, and if you took good care of the aina, then the aina would take good care of you. And they viewed their land and their resources as part of their extended family, and it would have been a disgrace and inappropriate to engage in buying and selling of it, like you don't buy and sell your brother or sister, so same way you don't buy and sell your land. Now, until pretty recently, Hawaii was still a self-sustaining subsistence place. This picture here is from the early 1800s, not so long ago. Here's the way Honolulu looked in 1853. Just a small village. You see here the location of the current Iolani Palace, which was a previous building. And then even as late as 1875, when this painting was done, you can see that there's virtually nothing in Honolulu. But today, of course, it's a megalopolis with skyscrapers and stuff. But there's still Hawaiian communities around the islands that are living in traditional ways and want very much to continue living in those traditional ways. And Hawaiians are restless. They very much want a change in their status. They want to control lands and resources. And in the last few years, year after year, there have been marches, protests, enormous outpourings of people on different issues that have come up, and we have a festering, unresolved problem that needs attention. Here's sometimes they protest in their own unique, special ways, and these protests continue and continue. Now, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the way land changed from the pre-contact period to the present. And the most important moment was the mahele, which means division, which took place under Kamehameha III at a time of great turmoil. Hawaii had been taken over in the early 1840s by a British admiral, and Europeans were coming around the Pacific, grabbing islands without restraint. And so King Kamehameha was very concerned that the Hawaii, which of course is the real prize in the Pacific, would be claimed by one of the imperialist powers. And so he tried to figure out how he could keep at least the land in Hawaiian hands, even if the sovereignty were somehow lost. And so he thought that if he transferred the land from this sense of common ownership to private property, that the Western imperialists would respect that. Whereas if it was all commonly owned, they would just claim everything as the new sovereign government. So he went through this several-year process to transfer the lands from public ownership to private ownership, and during that time various principles emerged that guided the process, and the basic idea is that there would be a division of the lands into thirds, sometimes it's fourths, depending on how they were characterizing it, but the king would keep about a third of the land, then the main chiefs, the ali'i, would keep another third, and the common people, the makainana, would keep another third. Sometimes the government would get a fair share as well, so sometimes it would be thought of as fourths. But in any event, the common people were always intended to get at least a fourth and perhaps a third of all the land. But as the process unfolded, the common people got squeezed out for the most part. So the king did wind up with about 1 million acres out of the 4.4 million acres in the islands. The ali'i took 1.5 million acres during the allocation. The government received 1.5 million, and the common people received 28,000 acres. So less than 1% of the the land, instead of the 1/3 or 1/4, went to the common people. Now, the king first managed his lands as sort of as private property. He bought and sold them and mortgaged them. But after a few years and after a couple of transitions among the royalty, the legislature passed a law in 1865 saying that these lands, the king's lands, which became known as the crown lands, should be not alienated, not subject to any transference, because they were supposed to serve the monarchy, to serve the crown. And so that was accepted as of 1865, and they were managed by a commission for the next 28 years until we get to the overthrow in 1893. So the United States participated actively in overthrowing the Kingdom of Hawaii, working with Western settlers in the islands. The United States had a big warship, the Boston, as you see here, that was in Honolulu Harbor for several years. There were previous warships, but the United States was always very much in presence there. This was, one of our best modern warships. Went on to fight in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. And in 1893, January, the Marines landed from this. In this picture, you can see the Boston back here in the background, and you see the Marines landing. And they went into Honolulu, took up positions, making it clear that they supported the Western settlers and opposed Queen Liliuokalani, and supported a transfer of a regime change of the government. Here you see them at what's now the Hawaii Supreme Court, Ali'iolani Hale, obviously there to intimidate the government and make it clear that there's to be a change. Now, the Queen then does abdicate, but she doesn't abdicate to the Western settlers. She abdicates to the United States, thinking that once people back in Washington realize what has happened, that they'll return the kingdom to her. And as it turned out, the President Grover Cleveland sent an investigator out, James Blunt, during the summer of 1893, and he did conduct an investigation, and he did think that the U.S. military and the U.S. diplomats had acted improperly. And Grover Cleveland releases this proclamation in December of 1893 saying that there was an act of war, a very strong term, a substantial wrong has been done, which the due regard for our national character as well as the rights of the injured people requires we should endeavor to repair. And so he did want to restore the monarchy and the kingdom, but met resistance from Congress. And we had then the same sort of gridlock that we have now with Democratic president, Republicans in Congress. And so nothing happened over the next few years in Washington. But in Hawaii, the white settlers set up an interim government called the Republic of Hawaii. And then in 1898, when William McKinley became president, Hawaii was finally annexed by the United States. Now, the Hawaiian situation fits into a broader scheme of rights of indigenous people, and we've seen just in the last couple of years, finally the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People promulgated by the General Assembly. This is a very important international document. Originally, 4 countries voted against it: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, but all 4 of them have now said they support this declaration, which is an enormous accomplishment. And President Obama said that the United States supports this as of December of 2010. This declaration clearly recognizes the separate and distinct status of indigenous people and their rights to live as separate and distinct people and to control their lands, their traditional lands and resources. Well, the annexation took place in 1898. It was done